Hello and welcome to Conversations at the Summit, the podcast brought to you by Climb UK. I'm Tanya, Arnold, and on this episode, getting to the top young. What's that journey like and what's the reaction to you in the boardroom?
I just turned 29. The fund I work at, Beringea, has propelled me and said, you're ready, go take on a board director seat. But that's also sometimes quite intimidating when you walk into the boardroom for the first time, and you can kind of see people looking and going, I'm twice your age. What business do you have being on this board? What can you really add here? That gives you a bit of confidence to say, actually, no, I am here for a reason. My voice, it does need to be heard. And eventually, you do say something that a founder listens to or thinks about, or and over time, you just build that confidence.
On this episode, we're joined by Jodie Miller, investment manager at the venture capitalist firm Beringea. Have I got the name right?
Yes.
I have got the name right. Fantastic. And as ever, Climb's head honcho, Gordon Bateman. So Jodie, just tell us a bit about what the company does.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me, first of all. It's my first podcast recording, so I'm very excited. I've been at Beringea for coming up 3 years. Beringea is a venture capitalist fund. We have offices in the US and the UK. So we have a really nice transatlantic approach to help kind of UK entrepreneurs when they're thinking about US expansion. We've got a lot of kind of resources, team and funds in place to help along that journey. We manage about $900 million across the two funds. We typically invest kind of a check size, first check size of around anywhere from 2 million all the way up to about 7 million pounds. And we're a sector agnostic firm. So we've invested across, I'd say, 3 main pillars, which are consumer, software and tech-enabled services. So pretty broad range. And we've been around for kind of 30 odd years. So quite a long standing kind of track record and history with the fund.
It seems apt that you've ended up in a UK-US firm, because the US has played a big part in your career to this point, hasn't it? Because you opted to go to uni out there.
Yeah. When I was looking for a role in venture when I was in London, I really was focused on finding a fund that had a US presence. Like you said, I did my undergraduate degree in New York. I was at NYU's business school, Stern. And actually that was where I had my first experience in venture capital. So I did an internship in VC when I was studying as kind of a part-time job. And I saw just the excitement of being in venture, being so close to these entrepreneurs who were building such incredible businesses. It was a job full of change because, you meet one founder who's, building a software business in, construction. And then the next day you meet someone who's building a really exciting consumer brand. So super varied. And I saw that essentially the US is such a huge and exciting market that I think having a US kind of angle, a US presence is kind of increasingly important for UK entrepreneurs because I think at some point in their journey, not all, but many entrepreneurs think about the US market when they set their sights on, scaling from that 2 million of revenue to that kind of 50, 60 million of revenue.
So when did you get interested in investment? Was it as a teenager there was something that bit you about it? What was the trigger for you?
Yeah, I always loved businesses, small businesses. So, growing up, I loved watching, TV programs like The Apprentice. I got into this podcast called How I Built This by Guy Raz, where they talk to kind of huge entrepreneurs in the US and basically let's talk about, their journey, all their mistakes, their wins along the way. And I just got, drawn in by those stories, I think.
Go back a little bit. Why did you go to university in the US? What was the hook there? Where did that come from?
I get this question quite a lot. I have an older sister, and watching her go on the UK university journey, she loved it. It was a great fit for her. But I felt the UK education system, where you kind of have to lock in to one subject and, study that one degree for 3 or 4 years. I'm someone that just loves change, for better or for worse. And I was kind of looking at different education systems across the world, and came across the liberal arts approach in the US, which is essentially you don't have to kind of lock into that one subject, one degree. You get to keep studying a really broad range of subjects, and then you decide what you want to essentially specialize in later. So that was the big appeal. And then I think the second thing was just really wanting to live and work abroad. Was a big draw for me as well.
And your internship that you did in a VC over there, I mean, a lot of things people talk about here, isn't it, is the difference between venture in the UK and the US. And we'll probably dig into that later on. But, just that internship and then having come and working in the UK in a large VC fund, was there much difference between the two? Was it a culture shock coming back here?
Yeah, there's such a big difference, I think, in the UK and US. And I was really naive when I moved to New York. I thought, same language, we all watch a lot of the same TV programs. Like, how different can it be? It was huge. And the other thing about the US is people think of it as one homogenous market. It's kind of 50 kind of markets. So I think my experience is very, New York centric, and I would never want to classify that as a US experience. I kind of acknowledge that like living in New York is very different to living in, Texas or, California or, various different states. But overall, like my experience in a New York venture fund was that their appetite for risk is just so much greater. And there's a much more of a, what can go right versus what can go wrong. And I think the people that are working in venture in the US tend to come from a startup experience rather than from a financial background. That was my other key thing I've kind of noticed. And I think that does play into the mentality that the US has when it comes to kind of startups.
And do you think the internship experience in the US is different? It's sort of got a bad reputation in this country that it's only accessible to a certain level of people if the parents happen to know somebody and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's another big aspect that drew me into the US education system is its the university experience is people kind of, when I went to open days in the US, a big thing they talk about is, what job are you going to get at the end of this? Like, what is your like return on investment for, spending all this money on this education? And they were very open about, you need to get a job after this and make it worthwhile. And so there's a huge amount of support in US education at universities around helping you get internships and paid internships, not free internships. So I think that was a big driver for me wanting to be there was, most people at NYU at some point in their degree are also working part-time, but kind of in relevant fields they want to end up in. And I love that because I didn't want to go to university and just study. I really wanted to figure out what did I want to do with my life. And NYU is a great place to kind of figure that out, I think.
We're trying to drive a lot of this through the whole Climb experience, not just our main event. So the whole social mobility piece and getting access to amazing talent from non-traditional sources is close to my heart. We see a lot of people who are working in venture, you said, have come from finance backgrounds in the UK. How do we make that better so people from more diverse backgrounds can get in? And we have this internally in our own organisation I actually stole a lot of things from US models with our internship. So it's a kind of, you're not coming here and making the tea. You're actually, as an intern, going to sit in front of a CEO or an investment manager or whatever and have real experience coming out of it.
Yeah.
And it's something that we're talking a lot about and we want to do a lot about. It'd be great to have you involved in that, of how we can kind of shape and shift the playbook, if you like, of how we get different people into the sector.
Yeah, definitely. No, I see that a lot. I was shocked when it was very difficult to break into VC in the UK, and there was this constant pushback of, you need more experience, you need to do this, this and this. And whereas I think you do see in venture in the US, younger people, much younger people starting in it. And there's a much more of a willingness to take on people with less experience. Yeah. And I think that we need to get to that place in the UK. I think we need younger people being in venture because there's sometimes there's businesses or that quite frankly, even I am potentially like too old at my age to evaluate or be able to assess. There are amazing, really young entrepreneurs, like 18, 20 years old. We often take an intern at least kind of twice a year. And it's just amazing when you have like an 18 to 22-year-old at the desk who just brings such a different perspective because, there's so, TikTok is like a great example. So many people in my office don't use TikTok. And, you need people in the team to be able to bring that perspective and know what's actually going on in the market.
I'm going to be terribly rude, and I have to confess you're the only person I've asked this, but because it is relevant, can I ask how old you are?
Yeah. I just turned 29.
A whole 29. Both Gordon and I are considerably older than that. Now, the reason I asked that is, you are high up in a big company. How did you get the experience to get your foot in the door with that, particularly given what you've said about how difficult it is as somebody young to get your foot in the door?
I had a range of experiences, and I think NYU was really formative in that. And I'm very, very lucky. I went to a university in the middle of a city. So I completely acknowledge, that's a huge privilege, where there were all these internships available to me. And I was able to do those. It's a huge privilege. So I had a range of experiences, both working at startups. So one that was super formative for me was I worked at a business called Updata, which at the time was publicly listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. It was probably the equivalent of like a Series C startup. So for anyone who doesn't know, the kind of those Series A, Series C, it was probably around 100 people scaling to 200 people, very fast moving, had received venture money. And, that experience just really was formative for me of understanding I wanted to be really close to a high growth business and within kind of that tech ecosystem. But I believe the experience for me that really helped me get into venture, I worked at Strategy which is PwC's strategy consulting arm. I was specifically in their private equity deals practice. So we were doing essentially assessing large businesses, so predominantly kind of medium to super large businesses across different sectors from a commercial angle. So we would analyze their business plan, we would interview their competitors, their customers, and essentially produce this very, very long report for potential investors or the investors selling the business, and assess it from a commercial perspective. And that enabled me to understand how do you rapidly assess a business and distill it into 5 key areas and understand what are the the risks, the opportunities, and then present that to a potential investor. And that was really, really helpful to be able to come into venture and essentially do that same skill set, but obviously at a much more micro level because you just have less data available to you, and do that very, very quickly.
And just so we're going to have a few different types of people listening to this. There'll be people who are listening to this who are thinking, either I or someone I know now they're learning the routing, but there's also people who are listening to this who own businesses who are looking at funding. So in a very quick, without you realizing you were doing it, you were actually giving people the idea of what you look for and how to assess a business. Just sum that up a little bit again. So when you were going back a little bit of when you, from being in a consultancy firm and looking at assessing a business, just bullet point almost the things that you looked for when you were assessing those businesses.
Of course. So it's quite helpful at Beringea. We actually, when we assess a business and we kind of bring it through to our investment committee, we have something called a scorecard, which really clearly lays out how we think about assessing a business. And I would preface that we invest at the kind of Series A stage. So typically businesses are generating, around over $1 million of revenue at this point. So it might not be as relevant if you're super early. But essentially the key buckets we look at are the market. So how large is the market that you're going after? So we would think about, a lot of pitch decks I see would have the huge market. So, for some consumer products, they might look at global, hair care sales across the world. We would try and distill that into, where are you selling right now? Which specific country? Are you a premium hair care product? Are you a mass market? And you really distill how large is that opportunity in that market size. The next thing we would look at is competition. So often in pitch decks, I will see, we don't have any competition, or, we don't think about our competition. We have to think about that all the time, and not just your competition right now, but who could be your competitors in the future. And what is your clear USP and your defensibility long term. So yeah, that's competition. The next is customer. So really distilling into who is your customer, and not just, your long list of your customers right now. Who is, we call it like an ICP, so ideal customer profile. So that means if you're selling to ideal customer profile, they're the person that will, the sales time is much shorter. They buy into your proposition much easier, and then understanding how many of those ICPs actually exist today. And then the other really important aspect for us is team. So, who are the founders? What are their backgrounds, their skill sets, their experiences? Why are they uniquely positioned to solve this problem, tackle this, scale this business? And then the second thing we look at within team is who have they hired and who do they plan to hire over the next couple of years? And are they good at, making those hires, finding those hires, and potentially looking at, do they have relevant kind of advisors or a chair or, some sort of board construction? Or if it's not a formal board, maybe it's, it's just some informal advisors that they're working with.
Is there an element of gut instinct involved, or because you've got this chart and you're scoring them? Have you ever sat there and gone, tick, tick, they score well, but my gut instinct is just saying there's something missing here?
Yeah. So that scorecard is typically, we use that much further along in the process. So like you said, that there is definitely more of a gut and a feel, because we probably assess around 2,000 businesses a year, and we'll invest between 3 to 5 new businesses each year. So you think about that funnel of getting from the 2,000 to the 3 to 5, and you can't do that scorecard, every time. And so there is an element always of, these are our high level criteria. This is our gut of, quite quickly you learn that market size isn't big enough for a business to be built, or, that growth isn't fast enough for what we're looking for, or, that team doesn't really make sense for what they're trying to achieve. So yeah, that there is sometimes an element of subjectivity for sure. Yeah.
And how does that get into your radar? How does a business get into your radar? Because I'm sure if people just put something on your website or send you an email, I assume you've got partnerships and other organisations you work with who bring you deal flow. So again, if we think about our audience, who should they be buddying up with that can make the intros to you, so that might jump them up the queue of getting into that? Where does your deal flow come from, mainly?
Yeah, it is actually a really wide range of sources. So I can't speak for everyone on my team. I actually do spend a lot of time looking at companies that come inbound to us. There are actually several examples of our portfolio. I can think of one top of my head, business that we backed called Gorilla, which is an energy SaaS solution, so software business. They sent a LinkedIn message to one of the partners on our team. We ended up investing in that business and led their Series A round. So I never discourage an inbound message. Definitely do it. And if you have a strong proposition, I do believe you'll get through. But outside of kind of, those cold inbound messages, because I do appreciate sometimes they will get missed. I would say we have a range. So we sometimes have, angel investors will come to us with, I've made an angel investment in this business. I think it's doing very, very well. That I think actually doesn't happen often enough in this market, which I find really interesting, that, if you've got an existing investor, use them to find introductions, because we also want to build those relationships with those angels, because they also provide us with other deal flow. So yeah, existing investors or angels or venture funds that have invested in you. The other thing we are actually seeing a lot more of, and it depends on types of funds, but with our funds specifically, we do find I would call them like advisors. So smaller corporate finance advisors. We do see that sometimes with Series A raises, where they'll approach us and they help essentially the company with that fundraise. So there are a few really good organizations that do that. And then I would say out of that, we also just do a lot of data-driven research. So, we might pick a sector or a thesis or a trend that we're really looking into. And then we use platforms, like Deal Room, for example, which we're actually an investor of, which is a data platform for small businesses, private companies. So we may, discover you on Deal Room, for example. That would be the other way.
I think it's interesting. So we created Investor Ladder for exactly that. So people talk about London and the North and a number of different things, but it's even the same in London, is that connection between investors, because your seed investor is speaking the same language as the Series A and Series B. So I genuinely agree that those guys should be doing the heavy lifting for you, to make those connections. And I think founders often forget to say to their investors, well, who do you know?
Yes.
And if I was choosing an investor at the very early stage, I'd be asking them, when we get to the next stage, are you as an early stage investor going to be able to introduce me to investors further on? But that just doesn't happen enough. That's part of why we created, that's exclusively why we created Investor Ladder. And part of why we created Climb as an event was to bring all of that together, because that supply chain is really important. Going back to the people side of things, one of the things that you look at team and everything else, diversity's clearly got to be part of that because of diversity of thinking. What's your experience in that? A young woman working in venture, which is notoriously populated by people that look very similar to me, I guess, really.
Yeah, I actively really push to find female founders. I need to do more of it. I'm definitely working on it, but it is something I try and focus on. Is like each quarter, how many female founders have I tried to bring in or source or speak to? So it's definitely and female founders. That's one lens. There are several lenses that we need to do way better in the venture community. But I think with female founders, we're making good steps. There's still a long way to go, but there's great initiatives like Playfair, which is a seed stage venture fund. They've organised an amazing initiative around female founders office hours. So it just creates this one afternoon. I think there are kind of over 100 venture funds now that participate. They match you with, I think I end up speaking to around 5 female founders in that afternoon, and there's so many conversations that happen in that one afternoon alone. I believe it happens on a quarterly basis. So there are initiatives like that do exist. But no, I think everyone needs to work harder at going out and finding more female founders, building those connections. And it is something that we track in our deal flow. How many female founders are we speaking to on a quarterly basis? But yeah, it's something that we need to keep working on.
But it's also more of a team as well, isn't it? It's not just female founder.
Yeah.
It's who's in the team.
Exactly. No, and looking for founders that have, not the just classic, working at a big tech fund, working at a big tech corp, that on paper, sometimes, you get that bias of, oh, well, if they've worked at Google, then, of course they're going to be amazing at building this business. And that's just not often the case. So I think it is, like you said, it is also challenging thinking in that investment committee around, do they have the right experience to build this specific, this company, and drilling into, we try and focus on sector expertise rather than over-indexing on, did you work at this shiny brand or this shiny company?
Do you remember the first time you found yourself in the boardroom, as an advisor or as part of the board, and what the reaction to you was?
Yeah, I've found it less about being a woman and more about my age. So I think that, that could be just my imposter syndrome, but it is really hard when you're, I'm really grateful that the fund I work at, Beringea, has propelled me and said, you're ready, like go take on a board director seat. But that's also sometimes quite intimidating when you walk into the boardroom for the first time, and you can kind of see people looking and going, I'm twice your age. Like, what business do you have being on this board? What can you really add here? So I think from that perspective, it can be really challenging. But what does help is because Beringea, we often lead rounds, we often do take a board seat. There are, things and protections in there that, your voice does have to be heard from a legal perspective. And not that I rely on that or reference that at all in a board meeting, but I think that does, for your own self, that gives you a bit of confidence to say, actually, no, I am here for a reason. My voice, it does need to be heard. And a lot of it is just building that confidence, I think, over time of, eventually, you do say something that a founder listens to or thinks about, or and over time, you just build that confidence.
Do you have that thing? And I speak from my own experience in the world that I was in, but you feel you have to almost prove yourself twice?
Yeah, for sure. And I see it a lot where something, I can't remember where I heard it from, but it was always a few of the conferences I've gone to around women in VC is on boards is, the best thing you can do is be overly prepared. So I just always, read the board pack front to back. I always send my comments in advance. I find that helps me a lot because, if I've already sent my thoughts, my questions on an email in writing to the whole board, then it's like, well, these questions can't be ignored. And I'm not going to get to a point in the board meeting where I go, oh, actually, I'm not going to bother asking that because it's out there, it's in plain sight. So I think that's been a tool that I think's really helped me.
I think it's tough though, isn't it? We had to cut this out of somebody's podcast recording. We were doing it remotely where they said they were on the board of a business and they introduced a relatively young, very successful CFO who was a woman. And one of the board members said, we can't have a girly in this level of seniority. We had to cut it, not because of the content, but because he actually named the company. And we thought
it was a little identifiable.
It was a little bit too close, but and he left the board. He said, I can't work with a business like this because the issue we face is there's no diversity of thinking. And I think the age thing is very much a UK, as you mentioned it about when you were in New York, it's very much a UK thing. We've had this with our headhunting business, CRSI, where we've introduced exceptionally bright people at a relatively young age into boards, and they've got rejected because the same comment of what experience have they got. It's like, well, they think differently to you. They've got different points of reference and you're targeting their generation. So actually it's a sensible thing to do. And again, I think there's work to be done in the sector to understand what an awesome board looks like. I think there's a phrase that I use a lot that I can't remember who said this, but I hired your CV, but unfortunately I got you. And I think it's very true what you say about big corporates. Someone who's been amazing at a big established company isn't necessarily going to take a high growth business to the next level. Yeah,
exactly. I find it easier sometimes. I mean, we invest in consumer, and I find that's an easier way to really kind of show that, your age is actually can be a strength, not a weakness. So, I'm on the boards of two companies that are consumer businesses. And I think that's where I, feel more comfortable because there are things that, maybe other people on the board that aren't as plugged in to, what's going on, online, social media, and kind of, your kind of knowledge of, of well-being trends or influencers, those kind of things is where I do realize in venture it's a real strength having that perspective. But there are times when I'm on a board where I also acknowledge, I'm going to be quiet and listen because there are topics sometimes I don't have the relevant experience. And I think that's also fine, is knowing when on a board when to speak and when to listen. And I think sometimes a lot of people have told me they sit on boards with people that just love to speak for the sake of speaking. And for me, that's I've always, listened to myself, talk to myself about that of, only speak when you really think you can add value. And there are times where it's a real privilege to sit on a board at my age. And there is so much I learn from the founders, from other investors, from chairs on boards. So I also acknowledge that there are amazing times where I can just sit back for half an hour and listen and just, soak it all in and learn a huge amount in that instance.
And have you had mentors along the way, or is this been all lessons that you've learnt yourself, so to speak, the hard way?
Yeah, I actually really would Yeah, it's something I've been reflecting on recently is I really need to find mentors now in my career. I think I was really good at it when I lived in the US because it was a real culture, I think, in the US that they had that mentorship, that sponsorship. And I think also when you work at a big corporate like Strategy and PwC, it's more built in. I think when you are joining VC or, smaller companies or industries that aren't as kind of, dominated by these massive companies, I've realized it's something I definitely need to try and seek out because, VC can be quite a lone wolf kind of space because, you're going out by yourself, speaking to all these companies, pitching these companies to your IC. And I think it's becoming, more important, I think, in my career to try and find those mentors. I'm really lucky that there are quite a few women in my fund, and Emma Biasolo, who's an investment director at Beringea. I'd say she's probably my unofficial mentor. She's been amazing at helping me navigate all these sort of situations as I've been at the fund.
And do you see yourself on the flip side? I mean, I know you're only 29, but you want to see more younger men and women coming through of even at the ripe old age of 28, mentoring some of those coming in and just pushing the case for them.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that's going to be so important as we progress in venture in the community. So no, I'm definitely very, very keen to do that and provide that. So I would love to get involved with that initiative.
It's interesting. So outcomes coming out of our Climb Festival every year, one of which is the most talked about is companies find an investor and they get investment. We've had examples of all different levels, 2 million, 5 million that they've met at Climb. The biggest one in volume is people who've got mentors. So the key element is, and there's been a theme in 2025, I don't know where it's come from, a bit of a channel around motorsport. And everyone knows that they've been on the bottom step at some point. And it's the same within high growth businesses. So the difference between a corporate is they might have a mentoring program and they'll have budget. So with an EY or PwC, you get into a program from an early stage business. That's harder because where do you find those people? And that's what we created inadvertently at Climb is, yes, we've got all these amazing speakers and sponsors and investors who come to the event, but it's the meet in the street, as I call it, where you find someone who's 5 years further on in the journey and then they take you under the wing. So I've got 6 people who are my mentors, and you know what? It costs me lunch every month with each one of them. So I meet them all twice a year for lunch, and I just buy the lunch. Sometimes they buy me lunch, which is kind of handy. But the thing we've found is that those later stage people are learning more from the mentees as much as they're giving the mentoring back. So they're learning more entrepreneurial things. So that, I think that mix is critical, and encouraging founders to do that. I find a lot of people go, I'm too busy. And it's like, spend a couple of hours with these people and it can save you years of your life. So it is a big kind of inadvertent outcome that's come from these big events that we've put together, is the people who just meet each other and then connect and become a mentor. So tip for next Climb is get into that network and they are amazing people. I mean, we have billionaires, exited entrepreneurs, thought leaders all over the place, just walking around for 2 days. And everyone wants to help. So, and I have found in this community of high growth businesses, 90% of people are just really helpful, and they're not just chasing a quick dollar to get a gig as a coach or whatever. They just actually want to help.
Yeah.
One of the things that when we're going back, when I asked you about gut instinct, is there a company that have come to you and you could just feel that buzz, that excitement almost instantly, and it's worked out, and you've just gone, just from the moment I saw this, I wanted in?
Yeah. Gosh. Off the top of my head, it's probably one of our portfolio companies. It's a business called Moth Cocktails. They are a ready-to-drink, very high ABV kind of cocktail bar quality taste in a can. Again, talking about age, 2 very young founders came in, no kind of alcohol experience, but huge passion for food and beverage. And again, it's just, coming back to age, just seeing if you look at the kind of aisle, in any of the supermarkets around, tins and cocktails, it's pretty low quality. It speaks to, it's pretty outdated, these like bright pink cans, bright yellow cans. And they realize, that there's a real gap in the market for people that really love a cocktail. They want it ready to drink, but it needs to be kind of closer in to a bar quality kind of taste. And Sam and Rob came in and they just had this crazy amount of kind of enthusiasm, energy, but also they had managed to build this incredible group of heavyweight drinks specialist advisors, from the likes of kind of Diageo, and they attracted that level of expertise and mentorship. And I think that is just so impressive to be able to build that. At the stage that we invested, they already had these people around the table really excited about what they were building. So yeah, that's probably the one that comes to mind for sure.
And it must be so lovely to be part of that journey and to see them flourish.
Yeah, and yeah, you get so excited when you go into, now they're in all the supermarkets, across the UK. They're now making really exciting headways into the US market in Publix, in Florida. So yeah, it's really exciting, particularly with a consumer product where you can touch and feel it and, share it with all your friends and bring it to parties. And I feel really proud of that.
I guess that's beneficial for them being part of the Beringea family now, because if they're expanding to the US, you've got that US fund. Is that something that you actively look for, that in businesses you invest in, that ultimately they will expand to the US?
Yeah, it's kind of not a requirement for us. So we've definitely invested in businesses where the US just doesn't make sense, and that's completely fine. So another drinks business we invest in, business called Dash Water, which is like a sparkling flavored water brand. The US is super saturated with other brands in that space. But we saw a huge opportunity for them to, dominate the UK and Europe. So in that instance, US doesn't make sense, and we're super excited to go on that journey with them and build a big business outside of the US. But I think where we see, for Moth, for example, the US is such a huge opportunity and a massive prize for them to go after. I think where we spend a lot of time is understanding, could this product and proposition work in the US? Where we see that there could be a potential. And I think in that instance, that's kind of where we got really drawn in and really excited about them. And we use our kind of US fund, US portfolio companies to also think through that strategy as well.
Just finally, Jodie, if you've talked about a lot of people who look like Gordon exist in your world.
Smarter dress,
what would you say to a young woman who's pondering about her career, has heard about this thing, about you can feel your passion for what it is that you do.
Yeah.
So just but they're looking at it thinking, I'm not sure that's the right fit for me. What would you say?
Yeah. Oof. I would say one. I would say, kind of try and reach out and talk to people that work in venture. And I mean, the other way to do it is actually, I always tell people, go work in a startup. It's probably the best way to experience whether you think you may like venture, because it's chaotic, it's fast paced, it's messy in the best way possible. And see if you actually kind of like that idea, and even if you kind of listen to podcasts or read about startups or businesses that have scaled, does that naturally interest you? Do you wake up in the morning and you want to learn about different businesses? If you don't, it's probably not the right job for you. And I think that's why I kind of knew it was a really it was a career I wanted to pursue, because I just loved learning about different businesses at the really early stages. And I think, yeah, like I said, if that's something that excites you, then definitely, I would say, network, speak to people, try and, whether it's working in a startup, attending some events, attending conferences, yeah, that's probably what I would say. And actually, if you're at university, a lot of the universities actually have kind of spin out organizations, tech hubs. So I'd say seek those out as well. And there is also a really amazing business. I think it's called Jumpstart. Does anyone know?
I've not heard that name.
I believe it's called Jumpstart, where they take people who've got, no experience and they match you with full-time jobs and startups. I will fact check that, but I believe it is called Jumpstart. I would check them out because I've heard of quite a few people doing that program, getting paid opportunities in startups. And I think that's a really good way to get insight into what it's like.
I think it's excellent advice because, again, we touched on this earlier. It's that we need more people in venture who've actually been in a startup.
Exactly,
men and women, who've actually been, in those shoes and know what it's like. So, and it is a great way to identify, because it's not for everybody, is it? It's a tough,
it is,
relentless sector that you work in.
For sure. No, exactly. Yeah, I'm so passionate about that. Just, getting more people in VC at younger ages who've worked at startups and can relate to founders and businesses about how hard it is. Because I think we can often forget that. Like, at the end of the day, scaling a business from 0 even to 1 million is an incredible achievement. I've not done that. Many people haven't done that. And I think having that perspective and that empathy of how difficult it is so important.
Been fascinating listening to your journey. I think they should have you as the poster girl for changing the face of venture capitalists and getting there. Jodie Miller, thank you so much for your time. Join us again for more conversations at the summit.